All right, shall we get started?
Yeah.
So, I'm Vinay, and this is Hexier. The name of the talk is DIY Everything, and I'm going to start from one example and then go back to discuss a range of possibilities and then do some analysis. So we're going to go from a very specific thing back out to the rest of the picture and then figure out whether there are any holes in the basic story. So if you spot something that doesn't quite make sense or that you don't follow, stop me and then we can sort of work on that and explain. So this is the Hexier. Invented in 2002, more or less by accident, based on Buckminster Fuller's work, and it's a very simple open source house. The degree of simple, is there a pointer to this stuff?
Pointer.
So the point of the Hexier is that it's a very, very simple technology. The entire magic is this wall is a single piece of 4x8 sheet, or 1.2 by 2.4 meter, and this triangle is also half a sheet. So you literally just take the pieces, you cut like this, bang, instant houses. And you can make them out of just about anything that the industrial supply chain has. Come forward. Right? There's your wall piece. There's your roof piece. These are the little connector blocks. And they're 120-degree angles and 60-degree angles. And there you have very, very simple housing technology. And at this point, you see how simple it is, right? There's just nothing more to explain. Just about anybody who's technically skilled can go and build one after 2 minutes of introduction and maybe 2 pictures. Bam! And that's very typical of the free technologies which actually work. They tend to meet a very simple, quick, easy, get started kind of interface. Forward, right? There's your parts list for this building. 12 panels, 3 2x4s, 200 screws. And you see, we've got this radical compressed simplicity. What this means is that we can change the manufacturing technology for the panels to just about anything without having to screw with the core of the design. Sandwich panels, cardboard, aircraft aluminum, honeycomb polypropylene, honeycomb cardboard, plywood, OSB, plastics. You can basically take anything that comes off the industrial supply chain and build these. And what you get from that is a sort of orthogonality like you see in a programming language where the function is Hexier and the input is more or less anything that comes out of the industrial system, and you get this, but you get this with cold weather, hot weather, extremely strong, extremely cheap, temporary, permanent. It's a completely adjustable range of possibilities because you've managed to work directly on top of the industrial supply chain. It's kind of like working with standard European paper sizes. Once you pick a standard European paper size, you can go up and down in size completely fluidly from a little postcard up to a huge sided building poster, A-6 printing. The reason this matters is usually everything to do with houses is a complete pain in the ass. Right? It's 75,000 different components, it's enormous amounts of expense, it's 300 euros for a window which has to be made to sub-millimeter precision, otherwise it's not waterproof. It's all of these kind of problems, and as a result, housing is absurdly expensive. It's just crazy, right? I mean, I recently did the calculations. I could replace every piece of technology in my life with the best kind of prosumer equivalent thing that's being manufactured now for the same price as 4 months of rent for a cheap apartment in London. And this is a total distortion. Thank you. And this is a total distortion in the way that things are in other areas, right? Housing and cars have managed to stay extremely expensive because they're extremely complicated. And as a result, we've got a massively distorted global economy where everything is screwed up. The whole nature of this economic crisis that we're in is that the price of paying for infrastructure and housing and all these basic utilities for people has turned out to be so expensive, we've borrowed all of the money and bankrupted Europe. And the situation in the US is just as bad. Bad engineering turns into bad financial problems and turns into terrible, terrible policy. That's a real issue. Can we check, is that camera running? Do you see a nice, do we have a countdown? When it gets close to running out of time, it only shoots in 30-minute blocks. Let me know and I'll pause and restart. So does that kind of make sense so far? You take a simple technology, you plug it into the industrial supply chain, you get this orthogonality, but it's unlike the way we do just about everything else. It's the return to this kind of simplicity that might give us the possibility of a technological breakout that would fundamentally change the way that our civilization operates. And it's my belief that if we don't make that breakout, we are in serious danger of winding up at least back on the farms and possibly back in the caves. It's that serious. So let me show you the first real set of innovations that came from this. Should pick the one that's animated. This one? There we go. So this was the first text here. That's the common one. These are the simple modifications of it. This GIF is going on fast. These are the big domes, and these are the enormous hybrids. And we've got maybe 7 different designers that have worked on this. All of them start with 1.2 by 2.4 meter boards, and all of them work with the same basic approach if you have whole boards or half boards. Let me show you in particular a couple of good examples. This is the big dome. Every single triangle on this, except for these ones, is 1/2 of a sheet of plywood, or whatever it is you happen to have. So your manufacturing instruction is take the boards, cut them in half, and screw them together into these shallow cones. This triangle here, you can see, is basically a single sheet. You cut off one corner at the halfway point, and that makes the triangle that covers that face. Have any of you ever built a Buckminster Fuller style geodesic dome?
How do we build one? Yes.
A dome?
Fuller. Yeah, to be the one here built, right? Fuller domes are a pain in the ass, aren't they? All of these different pieces, all of these different lengths, trigonometry, 5 components.
Well, it's 3 components and just one connector.
Yeah, it's not too small. When you start trying to cover the domes with panel materials to make something that insulates or is strong,
The covering is the pain in the ass.
it's a pain in the ass, right? And it's a pain in the ass because the things don't fit. Right? They don't fit because the Fuller geometry existed in the abstract with no supply chain in Buckminster Fuller's mind. So Fuller worked out the mathematical optimization based on spherical trigonometry, which doesn't map into anything we can actually produce in industry. So what we did for these was we started with the industrial component, and this was produced by a mathematician called Edmund Harris, who simply said, right, give me your 2 tiles, and I'll design you a spherical tile. Ta-da! Use the right math, get the right solution, bring the complexity and cost down by literally an order of magnitude. And one of these little miracles is that Edmund produces this thing and uploads the designs on the internet. 4 months later, people we've never heard of are building them at Burning Man and sending us pictures. And, you know, this is amazing. Let's see if I can find a picture of this thing. Sorry, I have like 64 documents open because I'm trying to pull together a complex thing. Right. And we literally just got this email of, look, by the way, we built one. Boom. Wow.
Hey, that's as good as ours.
You're actually, did you use the dome calculator? That's,
Yeah.
Yeah. So I computed those numbers. There was a typo in Buckminster Fuller's patent in the 4th decimal place, and if you built to that design of a 48-foot dome, you'd get about a 6-inch error. And in 1995, some hippies came to me and said, Vinny, can you fix this? And it took me about 6 weeks, and then I figured out you could do it with Pythagoras. Totally embarrassing. So this sort of thing is a different kind of artifact from the things that we see frequently produced by our civilization. Right? It's a bit weird looking, it's a bit space age, but most of all, it's radical orthogonal simplicity. You can imagine a housing ecology where you've got these panel components in a bunch of standard sizes, and you've got some standard connectors, and you could take this thing and break it down into 4 hexayards. This section here is a hexayard roof. If you do the engineering a little differently, you can make a folding hexayard to exactly the same design. The roof panels fold at the centre of each section, the whole thing concertinas up. I can show some video of that later on. So, it looks like we could do single-family housing using a completely radical approach that's completely suitable for DIY. You buy the materials at the store, you want a structural insulated panel, you want aircraft aluminum, you want whatever it happens to be. You cut them on a table saw, which is a pretty cheap piece of hardware. You take them to where you're going to go and you bolt them together, and basically because you've got a very efficient, very strong design, you could fit the entire house in the back of an ordinary moving van, just for the insulated shell. Right? Floors and foundations are still a bit tricky, but eventually somebody will figure out a smart way of doing that, maybe ground screws. And, well, 30 sheets of material for 45 square meters. What does your material cost? 50 euros a sheet? 30 sheets of material, 1,500 euros for your bits. Maybe it costs 100 euros a sheet. Well, then it's 3,000 euros for a house. Now, we still got to figure out the bathroom and the showers and the electrical systems and all the rest of this. But you sort of see the direction that I'm beginning to ease towards. Right? Something very funny can happen here. And this was the original vision that Buckminster Fuller had, but he was working before we had this kind of design tools, before we had an open source or free ecology, before we had all the modern ideas. It's taken about 60 years for Buckminster Fuller's work to get simple. And when things get simple, that's when they begin to grow. If you have something which is simple and useful, and then people begin to build it and work with it and make modifications and make changes and contribute, you get this kind of growth into something useful. And it needs both the simple starting point and it needs this kind of percolating additional additive complexity. Make sense so far? Any questions about the hexayard, or we've pretty much wrapped this?
No, but it seems very good idea to help people who doesn't have a house, especially here in Greece with current financial status, to have a roof over their heads.
Thank you. And this is kind of what it was originally designed for, was refugees. The other thing is, this is a satellite picture from Burning Man, actually a drone picture of the flyover. And each red star is a hexayard. You can just about see the silver of the roof. So, last year at Burning Man, roughly 600 units built that we could identify from space. This year we completely sold out the material supply chain for the tape that you used to assemble the hexayard about a month or 6 weeks before Burning Man. So we don't know how many hexayards will be built this year, but it's enough that we sold out the total material supply chain for one of the components. You just can't buy the stuff in America. So now let's take a look at this from an abstract perspective, right? We've got a nice clear example. Let's look at the abstract. So this is a system called Simple Critical Infrastructure Maps. And you can think of it as being a sort of systems dynamics model for civilization at a very, very crude level. And I'll show you another form of this in a second. Let's just deal with the basics. So, 7 tiers of political organization. Why is that wrong? Yep. Back. Okay. Sorry. So, 7 tiers of political organization: individual, household, village, town or municipality, region, country, world. It's a very, very simple descriptive model that gives you a basic sense of how things operate. Reasonable? Just as a sort of first cut of the tiers of governance. Then on the other axis, we've got an 18-point checklist, which is the very, very simplest abstract form of what it takes to operate individual life, civilization, a state, however you want to think about it, the system. So that 18-point checklist breaks down into 4 levels: individual, group, organization, state. The first 9 items are physical, the second 9 items are organizational. This model is in use at the Pentagon, it's in use in government Spain, UK Ministry of Defence is quite into it, a lot of survivalists are using it. It generally seems to work pretty well when people start using it to do analysis. And it's a Creative Commons license. So for the individual to exist, you need protection from being too hot, too cold, hungry, thirsty, ill, or injured. And if all of those basic needs are covered, you will stay alive and go with them in your basic life. Does that make sense? This is the absolute, total, brutal simplicity of raw survival. Nothing more, nothing less. Once you have a set of individuals who are safe and secure, you get to a second question, which is how do you form a group? The perfect example. So, communications is how you knew this event was happening. Workspace is the space we're meeting in. Transport is how you got here. And resource control is why this is not currently being used for another workshop or as a bar. This is how we form groups. If we want to go from a group to an organization, and resource control, as you know, is the first non-physical thing, right? That's a social structure. If we want to go from a group to an organization, you need three sort of human properties or states of mind. You need a shared map of reality, which is a set of basic assumptions, right? If you're a church group, you have a completely different model of reality from, say, the police force or from a hospital. So the hospital's map of reality is we're a hospital, we treat diseases, these are the kinds of things we do, these are the kinds of people we have. It's an abstract model. And all of the hack spaces basically share a common map of reality, which is what makes them hack spaces. It's like cultural DNA. You then go to shared plan. So relative to some objective, this is what we're going to do. We have a forest fire, we're going to go and put the forest fire out. We have a conference, we're going to invite some speakers, we're going to make sure that there is food and drink and video recording and all the rest of these functions. Finally, what makes an organisation different from, say, a tribe is a shared succession model. If our leadership stops performing, we will have an election and we will replace the board. If our leadership stops performing, we will call the bishop and we'll have the guy replaced. And that's when you become an institution, an organisation where the objective is more important than the current leadership. And this is a critical psychological difference between organisations and social groups. Make sense so far? Now this is pretty abstract, but one of the problems that we have right now is that almost all of the organisations that run our societies are completely dysfunctional and very, very badly underperforming. The state is terrible, the police are terrible, the ambulance service and the fire service and everything else are 10, 15, 20 years out of date technologically. The educational system is a joke in most countries and it's worse than a joke in England. And you can go through and look at all of these organisations, they haven't been able to successfully update their maps to keep pace with the technological change and the social change of the 21st century. They all seem to act as if it's about 1970 or 1975. Maybe we should think about using this internet thing for education, perhaps. Maybe we could email students their homework. Really? This is the best we can do? Khan Academy is a total hack, right? You know Khan Academy? This guy who makes videos of Wikipedia articles. Reads the Wikipedia article a couple of times, explains how something works, draws diagrams on a kind of electronic whiteboard thing, puts the videos on YouTube, they get like 380 million views. And the fact that that's regarded as being a revolutionary thing in education gives you a sense of how badly the educational institutions are failing. MIT, we're the great leaders, we have open courseware. It's videos of lectures. This is what you got, videos of lectures. That's revolutionary electronic education. How is it, talking video, how is that thing going?
It has 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, okay. So, that problem with the institutional DNA, that's a place in your mental model you can put it. That map is out of date, the plans are therefore wrong, because if the map is wrong, the plan will be wrong. Finally, we get to this complicated thing called the state. Generally speaking, people are not very concerned about defining the state or thinking about what the state is. We sort of assume it into existence. My personal perspective is that I don't fear the state. the fear that the state will collapse before we have a meaningful alternative. Because the core organizations that make up the state all have shared maps which are so out of date they're no longer able to cope with reality. And a general historical rule is that when you require people to believe in something that doesn't exist, you have to hit them with a hammer to make them obey. And the best example of this that we have right now is the fact that the guys who founded the Pirate Bay are being extradited from countries like Cambodia and thrown in jail in Sweden to maintain a business model that has nothing to do with modern technology. Every machine that transmits packets when somebody moves a file across the internet technically has a copy of it. Computers copy bits. Primitive operation. CP, bam, 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 bam. It's right there in the microprocessors, very lowest architectural level. It's right there on the networks, it's in caching. You know, computers manipulate data. The first thing you do is you make a copy before you start hacking. Crazy, 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 crazy situation when we're attempting to prevent the use of the most basic function of an information processing system by throwing people in jail. Right? This is insanity. It's just bonkers. Right? It's the same sort of territories you got from the Catholic Church trying to enforce heresy regulations in, say, 1500 AD. I am very sorry, you are just not allowed to say that the earth goes around the sun. That's absolutely destructive to our faith. Tough. Right? And this notion that what we have is a pervasive social problem that comes from organizations with out-of-date maps is the core of the next step. Either the organizations radically update their maps or the organizations fail in their core mission. Does that kind of make sense? Educational institutions that fail in their core mission produce graduates who are clueless noobs. Fire services that fail in their core mission, you wind up with half of your country burning down and nobody seems to be able to do it. A state that fails in its core mission fails to ... Now we have to ask what's the function of the state. Does this make sense? I mean, I'm kind of digging through this in a little bit of detail because it seems like this kind of structural analysis might be interesting to you as hackers who live in a potentially failing state. So my model of the state is that the state's primary output is justice. It's courts of law, it's the ability to actually have a case tried and get an objective verdict. There are lots of cases where things like national defence have been organised by citizen militias, but generally speaking, anything that has a court is a state, and things that don't have courts are not states. And that's slightly arbitrary, but it's a much more useful definition than talking about use of force or the presence of an army or international recognition in the abstract. Your courts are what make it a state. So we say that the state has a legal jurisdiction, a map of territory where it claims that jurisdiction operates, a list of citizens that jurisdiction covers, and that's the sort of functional definition of what the state controls. These people in this geography. Then you need effective institutions to just do the general business of the state. And finally, if all of that stuff works well enough, you get international recognition. That's what makes you a country. Does this make sense so far? So you get things like the Basque country in Spain, where it's kind of a country and kind of not a country, and it's got a lot of these attributes, but it doesn't quite have a full set. But possibly if Spain had real problems, the Basques would just kind of flip the switch and ask for a flag. Oh, they already have a flag. They'd ask for a seat at the UN. Okay, reasonable. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that all of this stuff is potentially software. So this legal jurisdiction is an abstract thing, but a map of territory, well, that's OpenStreetMaps, isn't it? Right. A list of citizens, that's some kind of public identity database. You know, you could do Facebook if you felt like being a slave, or you could use the GPG Web of Trust if you felt like making your life really complicated. Remember Simple Public Key Infrastructure, SPKI? Then reborn as SDSI, Simple, I can't remember. Anyone remember what SDSI is? So very, very simple, sophisticated public key infrastructure that allows you to certify that you know somebody, it allows you to certify somebody's allowed in your house on this day, it allows you to generate a very, very flexible set of cryptographic tokens and certificates using a standard description language and really, really simple public key stuff. So you take something like that, and you can generate a list of citizens, and you can generate clever kinds of anonymous IDs where you show an ID at a bar and it lets you drink, but it doesn't tell the owner your name unless you punch somebody. We could actually generate a pretty definitive list of citizens that was cryptographically protected so that it couldn't be used to spy on us. And that's within the sort of domain of things that software projects do. We're building global infrastructure like Wikipedia, like OpenStreetMaps, all the networking stuff that's running on open source runs the internet. Free software, installable widely. So this is sort of like a very big software project. Effective institutions, we can't really touch that one because we don't have control of the institutions to change the way they operate. We got part of that. International recognition, well, we're generally operating in countries that already have international recognition. So an update of the way that the state operates so that you actually had properly digital stuff in there could result in radical shifts of the way that society operates without actually punching holes in the basic functions. Now, this is pretty speculative, right? But there are some examples of countries going down this path far away. Estonia issued a secure ID tag to every one of its citizens. So rather than having one of these things hanging off your keychain for every account, you would one, it was given by the government, and it had quite a good API that would allow your bank or any website that cares to use that token to authenticate you without having any access to the rest of the state's databases about your area ability to map your behavior across multiple sites. Does this begin to sound like a direction? So what I want to suggest is that the place where we're stuck right now is right up here, right? The problem that we have is that we're dependent on completely archaic infrastructure, civic infrastructure, for all of our essential services. The road network, the cars that drive on the road, the gasoline that goes on the road. That stuff is 150 years old and it's all garbage. Right? You could build a car that weighed 300 kilograms, ran on batteries, was charged from the sun and the wind, and got the equivalent of 700 miles per litre in terms of its net carbon output. There's a project called Hypercar from 1992 that basically outlines how you would do that. There's an open source car project called Riversimple, which is actually making a production hydrogen car to basically that template. And it's designed for small batch manufacturing in quantities as low as 1,000. Does anybody want to guess what the number one obstacle is?
The other companies?
Nope.
The price of the gas?
Nope. Right? Safety regulations.
Yeah, so basically that's the other components, right?
You could think of it as other companies. You could
So
think
we
of it as
go
the
to
state.
market,
Right?
people like that.
2 million euros worth of testing fees every time they have a new edit of the car.
There it goes.
Yeah,
Market's
right.
closed.
Market's closed. Well, I mean, they're hacking their way through it. They have backing from the Porsche family. That, more real interesting. Right? Yeah. Okay. Let me start that. Sorry. Now, this is a pretty, kind of controversial thing. But what I'm basically suggesting and that notion that you could actually do radical re-engineering, not just in software but also in hardware, is something that's springing up all over the place. Right? The idea that you could rewrite the basic software that runs civilization, that's basically happening all the time already. There's nothing radical about the idea of free software takes over the world. We're sort of maybe a quarter of the way there already and accelerating very quickly. I'm assuming that's kind of some kind of 3D printer?
Yep.
Yes.
Making
So we're beginning to start hacking on the physical manufacturing capacity, and right now, most of the stuff coming off 3D printers is a bit like, interesting. But by the time that's capable of printing a chair, or a server case, or a cleverly designed bag or a Rubik's Cube, it's beginning to become useful. By the time you could take a whole bunch of stuff, throw it through a melting shredder thingy, and then put it back in as feedstock, you begin to talk about closing some industrial loops where you want a little gadget, you print the little gadget, you use the little gadget, you get bored with it, you throw it back in the bucket. That begins to sound like a bit of a breakthrough. So, if we could use sort of new manufacturing technology and sort of new design processes and lots of open design methods to start redesigning the basic stuff that keeps us alive, we could actually fork civilization. Maybe it would be one house at a time, maybe it would be one village at a time, maybe it would be a country at a time. I personally think it might start at the refugee camps. But there's a possibility for building a radical new architecture that does basic life support on the same kind of principles and approaches that we use in software, and then shipping it into the gap that is left by the collapse of our institutions because they weren't able to update their map fast enough. It might be possible to catch a collapsing civilization and a collapsing culture with the fastest moving technology development process that humanity has ever seen. Kind of makes sense. So at that point, we could break that problem down into a set of fairly readily definable categories. If we can figure out injury, illness, thirst, hunger, cold, and heat, communications, transport, and workspace, we've got all the basic essentials to keep life going. And at that point, we'd be able to stand on our own feet. Make sense? Okay. So at this point, there's a couple of things we could do. We could actually, look at a whole bunch of different technologies. I could go, show you some videos from YouTube and some other bits and pieces that illustrate specific technologies and how they might fit together. Or we could do a bit more analysis, or I could talk through some more of this kind of theoretical stuff. What would you guys like? Any questions?
All this plan, how cost effective would be? Because there is not only the only analysis of society as a system, but only there is Marxist analysis that from economical aspect that separates a central core, how people satisfy their needs, and how this is expressed on society.
Yeah. Okay, so very good question. I'll give you an example that I know a little bit about, which is water. So the richer the country is, the less you pay for clean water, generally speaking. Africans who are buying clean water by the gallon are paying something like 13 cents per gallon of clean water. Americans who are buying clean water by the ton are paying something like a gallon per 50 cubic meters or something crazy like that. Almost free. So there are economies of scale in the economy, right? There are some things that it makes more sense to do a huge scale. For example, the Hexier uses plywood, and I don't think there's any point in people talking about having to make their own plywood. The right size for producing plywood is 3 or 4 factories per country, and you do it on a really, really huge scale. However, I think that a lot of these very basic feedstocks are completely beyond patent and copyright, and are already produced for 2 to 5% over the cost of manufacture, so they're already extremely efficient industries. There's some variation in that, but generally speaking, the raw materials for most of this kind of engineering are close to as cheap as they're going to get. Steel stock, welded gases, wood, screws, bolts, all that stuff is already very cheap. Ecosystem service capture is the tricky part, right? So you have a river, who's allowed to take stuff out of it and turn it into a product? You have the sun, who's going to sell you the kit you need to take energy from the sun and turn it into a product? What can you do with that product and how much can you sell it for? The bottom line is that right now most of that stuff is so complicated in its regulation and so over-specified in the amount of it that we use, it's very hard to figure out what the real costs are. For example, if you want to run a kettle off a solar panel array, you need something like 1,500 watts of energy, which turns into something like €4,500 of equipment to be able to run a kettle. On the other hand, you could heat the kettle from wood for about 5 euro cents, and it's just a massively more efficient way of generating heat. But you can't run your computer off a kettle for that into a solar panel. So when you start breaking down the water supply and the electricity supply and the natural gas supply and even the gasoline supply into what do we actually use it for, you get some radical possible breakthroughs. If you take the cities, you could ban automobiles in most of the urban core, and people would then feel safe bicycling to and from work, or they might ride very energy efficient on scooters and mopeds. But until you make a radical change, like taking the automobiles back out of the city, there's a limit to how far you can go with bicycles, because it's incredibly dangerous driving a bicycle around all those cars. Does this kind of make sense? Where the actual transformation point is, where it becomes too expensive to change, I think is undefined. Any more questions? Okay. So, shall we dig through some individual technological examples? Look at some technology, here's the open source car, here's the rest of this kind of stuff? Or should we talk a little more about the sort of bigger picture and the analysis?
Yeah.
Show of hands? Alright, videos.
Reverse simple has a problem right now. Last time I checked, the reverse simple didn't have something ready.
I've seen their car drive.
Oh, yeah.
We have.
I've seen enough of it.
It's ridiculous time.
Έλα, ποιος κάνει update.
So the frame of the car is a square section steel stock. It's about this big, and it's a simple bar provides the chassis. The skin of the car is carbon fiber, but it's managed in the same way you do fiberglass. So what they have is a set of CNC molds which will produce the mold for the car, and then your production plant, you make one of these molds or as many as you need, and you do the carbon fiber process by hand. So you have this carbon fiber monocoque shell which is bolted directly to the steel frame, and then the hydrogen system is basically an electric motor of a pretty standard kind in each wheel, and then a package of driver electronics which just sits on a set of metal boxes that bolt to the chassis. The thing is literally like a kit car, there's practically nothing to it. It's also more or less silent, which is really kind of cool. It just kind of goes zip, and it's got a hell of a lot of acceleration. That's the hydrogen tank. Right now you buy the hydrogen from commercial suppliers, but as you get more scale, you actually have electrolysis stations where you take electricity, particularly from wind power, and you split it into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is a product, and the hydrogen you then sell into the cars. And there's a whole lot of work about how you build a hydrogen economy, where you store your electricity from wind farms in the form of hydrogen, and then you use fuel cells to drive the hydrogen into the need that you actually have. Because wind farms produce very dirty electricity, and it's a total pain in the ass turning wind farm electricity into natural grid electricity. But it's actually pretty easy to turn wind farm electricity into hydrogen and then store it in tanks for transport and other applications. Reasonable? Right. And you've seen bits and pieces about things like open source bicycles made of bamboo and cardboard. Slowly people are working towards those kind of things. Bicycles are a bit tricky because they're very, very precise machines, but slowly they're getting easier. Any questions about the car? Yeah?
Yeah. I heard that the most difficult part of the everything is actually the hydrogen tank. As far as I've heard, they were thinking about introducing a hybrid version of River Simple, using a hybrid engine. But as far as I understood, the owners would actually buy the car and rent the engine. Yeah, it's actually it was how do you say? It would be a temporary solution. So you'd use a hybrid
I see.
engine for a while
Yep.
until hydrogen was introduced in a massive scale.
Okay.
Since we now have hydrogen massive scale,
Mm-hmm.
it's a little bit stupid to buy a car that runs on hydrogen.
Hmm.
So as far as I've heard, it was supposed to be like that. I don't know now what happened because I think that engineering the car in massive quantities hasn't really been fruititious. And you
Yes.
just can't go and buy a very simple car right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. The problems that they've been having are largely about how you get a completely new system ecology started.
Yeah.
So if we saw a complicated, nasty war in the Middle East and the price of oil went up to around 500 a barrel, River Simple goes from being kind of difficult to being a hell of a lot easier than running diesel. But until you have some kind of external kick to the system, it's basically sort of a hothouse flower.
Yeah.
You know, it will grow quite nicely in a greenhouse, and maybe you can set up a special deal where you have a gasoline refinery and there's a bunch of hydrogen coming off the side you can have cheap, and you sort of hack it into existence. But it's very clear that if you've got some kind of event that pushed the price of gasoline up, this stuff then, instead of being under the gasoline curve, is now over it, and suddenly it becomes fully viable in the commercial marketplace. It's clear that you could do this, you could scale it, they're pretty easy to make, there'd be a ton of employment for making the switch. But until you have a commercial incentive, capitalism won't make the shift. But if we had sane organisations that were charging a reasonable price for the carbon emissions from our standard vehicles, this would be much cheaper than a regular car. The reason we can't get to this technology is because the institutions are pounding the hell out of us by doing the wrong thing. Make sense? A tough thing.
Also, can a simple LPG car with LPG modification, instead of putting these one that heaters have to cook the chefs, instead of put this gas,
Yes,
use
yes.
hydrogen. Is it possible to use over LPG technology?
Okay, the issue is vehicle weight. So an ordinary car weighs about 2 tons, and the engine has about 45 kilowatts of generation capacity. So if you want to use hydrogen fuel cells and similar things, you need a very lightweight car, but the fuel cell has to be so large that it makes the car too expensive. Basically how it works. You have to redesign the whole system simultaneously.
Because here in Greece, there are many businesses that convert petrol-based cars using this type of gas. Instead of putting this type of gas, why not put hydrogen? The engine burns
Yes, basically it just doesn't work economically. The hydrogen is too expensive in that situation.
But if you can make it in your home, the hydrogen, or locally into your home, just buy a windmill or using this simple electricity and make your own fuel, I think it's much cost effectively, very simpler to think, too close to us. You make your home fuel, put it in your car and run. Do your daily job.
Yes.
And if you want to travel far, then this is the problem. For big distances, over 100 kilometers.
Yes, that makes sense. I think you're still going to find it's very expensive to burn the hydrogen rather than use it in the fuel cell, but I don't know the numbers. You could be right. So, do you guys know about a project called Open Source Ecology? You heard of it? So, the Open Source Ecology guys, have a very, very comprehensive approach to this, right? They want to build something like 60 machines, and the critical distinction between the approach they're taking and the approach that I'm taking is that the open source ecology guys want to be able to build all of the machines using the machines that they build.
Yeah.
And this is an architectural decision. So in my model of how we go about this, we assume that in the first step, you're going to be able to use pre-existing stock materials. So you can buy the square section steel to make the river simple, you can buy the panel material to make it hexier, you can still buy solar panels. And that's quite an assumption, but it's a reasonable assumption in a lot of ways. And the open source ecology guys want to bootstrap all the way up to full self-replication, total system independence on the first jump. And one of the questions I have with that is what's the minimum level of skill required to operate that whole system? There's no incrementalism in it. So if it works, it's going to spread absolutely like wildfire, but if it turns out to be a bit of a pain in the ass, it might be very difficult to get the first instantiation. And these kind of political strategic decisions have been right at the heart of the open source software movement and the free software movement from the beginning. Right? Stallman's absolute insistence on fully pure code from the very beginning and his hatred of every proprietary entry point has turned out to be more or less completely accurate. The open source perspective has allowed all kinds of evil and manipulation into the system because of the areas where people made compromise. And all of Stallman's worst fears about the inability to access books because the company you bought them from would wipe them from your device turned out to be dead accurate. So when you start doing the analysis, when you start looking at these kind of hardware plays, the system interdependencies on feedstocks are going to turn out to be very, very hot political issues. The 3D printers, for example, all of the big hardware companies like HP and so on have two basic concerns. The first is, if we start making 3D printers and people print illegal things on them, will we get into trouble? Maybe we could have government have a pool of approved designs which you could print like an app store, and then we would have to worry about somebody printing the components to make an F-16. Sorry, not an F-16, an M-16. I think printing an F-16 would be kind of ambitious.
A few days ago, there was a project about building 3D printed weapons.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, but this isn't the main purpose of all these things.
No, of course it's not, but it's applicable. You can
Yeah,
do it.
but you can
Okay, you can print the...
you can print whatever you want. This is freedom. If you use it through printer to print a gun or something like that, then it's up to you.
Well, right now it's up to you, but it's very easy to imagine legislation that put DRM on the 3D printer so you couldn't print those kinds
Yeah,
of
but
Yeah.
the truth is that already we have the technology to build weapons without using a 3D printer.
Yeah,
you can
exactly.
use a CNC machine,
Mhm.
a simple CNC machine,
Yeah.
to
But
build a weapon.
If I want to kill someone,
expensive, difficult.
I can use a knife. I don't have
Yeah.
to use a 3D printer to print a gun to kill.
It's the use that makes it a weapon, actually.
Yeah. But, you know, all of this kind of terrain, these are the kinds of arguments that we see about child pornography on the internet. They take a kind of ridiculous case and use it as a hammer to bash the technology very hard.
Okay, but the problem isn't the technology.
I
The
agree.
problem is ethics, freedom,
Yeah.
and in your first slide, I thought I would see a box about freedom or public rights or ethics or stuff like that, but I didn't see.
Yes. I generally focus on what is possible rather than what is moral.
Okay.
Just the way I do things. So let me point out the other angle on this 3D printer business. By and large, throughout the 2000 decade, from 2000 to 2010, and actually a little earlier, the only profitable part of most of the major computer companies was printer ink.
Yeah, because the cartridges are proprietary.
The cartridges are proprietary. They were charging something like $44,000 a gallon for ink that actually cost about $80 a gallon to
There is
make.
a new 3D printer,
Uh-huh.
really cheap,
Uh-huh.
with proprietary cartridges.
Ah, you see? Right.
And
So,
it's insanely cheap.
So 3D printers are going to go through exactly the same struggle that we saw with software and with DRM and with inkjet printers. There's going to be a struggle to put DRM on them, and there's going to be a struggle to put proprietary printing materials into them. And we're going to have to fight through that entire bloody cycle again. The difference is this time that we know where we're going. And the RepRap guys were bloody geniuses when they put the entire process on the path of start with replication, then make it good, rather than making it good and then winding up the proprietary version. They might have saved our bacon on this. Right? Genius, right? Really, really bold thinking. All of these kinds of political decisions about where do the feedstocks come from and who's got the ability to turn off your hardware get into the core question, which is all the way through the modern age, of who controls the things that you need to work. In Marxism, the question about who owned the factory was you needed the tools in the factory to be able to do your job, but the factory owner took most of the profit out of the situation. And the struggle between the person who provided you with the tool and your skill as a labourer was the struggle between capital and talent that dominated the political landscape really since maybe 50 years after Marx. Russian Revolution, all the shenanigans in Russia and China all come down to this fundamental dialogue. We have no new politics that accurately discuss the relationship between a human being, their software, their computer, their feedstocks for a 3D printer, their solar panel vendor, and the person that cuts off their water supply every time they have an insurrection, which happened several times last year, once in China, once in Egypt, a couple other places. So that entire set of systems I call infrastructure-centric politics. And what I'm really trying to raise here is that infrastructure-centric politics might turn out to be the key to freedom in the 21st century. What we did for software, we must do for critical infrastructure. The water, the power, the sanitation, the electricity supply, the communications, and everything else. Right, that's my thesis.
So in few words, open source ecosystem is a form of class struggle by Marx?
No. However, right, Stallman's original political framing very accurately identified software as the key struggle between people and any kind of authority. Whether it's a Marxist authority, or whether it's a capitalist authority, or whether it's a kind of authority we've never seen before, Stallman accurately predicted that controlling the software was going to be the same as controlling the society. So we got most of the way on the software, certainly good enough to be holding our ground. However, the next choke point is electricity, network provision, and water supply. And all of those choke points are being used by governments right now to throttle freedom movements all over the world. If you keep watching the news carefully, several times a year you'll hear a story of a government cutting off the water supply to an area that has been insurrection. Right? Think about how vulnerable Greece is to water supply interruption. Ouch. Right? And we've lost a lot of the psychological understanding that went with the fortress mentality. I see fortresses all over the Greek landscape. They've all got huge cisterns to store the water, because otherwise you could just siege them and they'd starve and they'd come out and kill you. Right? Thirst was what you used as a weapon. They're doing it in Egypt. Right? They're doing it in China. The notion that you have to have complete control of your life support infrastructure to be free is Gandhi, but it's also Buckminster Fuller, it's also Thomas Jefferson. The ability to stand on your own land and provide your own needs is the core of political freedom in most of the older political philosophies. Once you got heavy industrialization, people basically sold out to the market and assumed that control of the factory was the same as political freedom, which it's not. Make sense? Okay, so I figured I'd take maybe 2 questions and then we'll wrap up. Okay, any questions? Stick is bent. No questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay, what's your?
Okay. As far as I've understood, HexaView is more than system for built-in premises, houses, or whatever. As far as I've seen, read some slides you posted on Hackerspace's Facebook page. Which were very interesting. Comparing with open source ecology's view, sometimes I view that I see Marcin as RMS of the open source ecology, free software ecology, call it whatever you like, movement, and I see that you're a proponent of a more open source way, as in open source like open source initiative.
Yeah.
So, in practice, as far as I'm concerned, and I think most of the people here are thinking the same way, I don't know, is that actually most of us are, yes, proponents of the free software, free foundation, and we believe that free software is the key, but we usually use closed source systems too, to do our stuff, to be productive.
Yeah.
Actually, we don't want to. I mean, in the end, we believe that it is a transitional condition. We are using Skype because open source VoIP, P2P, not exactly.
Yeah.
You don't have it.
Yeah.
It's not there.
Yeah.
Not yet.
Yeah.
So I think that actually that's a system that it won't be a way to something, a hybrid between open source ecology and what you're trying to say. So I think in the end you end up having more freedom and having more open source stuff in our houses, hopefully. But actually it's more like we're on a way to that. We are way far away from that. Because using software, it's simple. I plug in a USB and there it goes. I have a laptop running Linux and a phone running open source version of Android. But I can't do that in my house. What can I say?
But yeah. If you were a farmer, it might be easier.
Yeah.
If you live in an urban setting, there's so much already installed infrastructure that you're kind of embedded in. But if you were a farmer in, say, Zimbabwe, you don't really have any infrastructure and you could go directly to the free stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that that's quite an interesting angle on this, that displacing the installed
There
base.
is a big issue.
Yes?
Very good.
Okay, good. Thank you. So imagine you're an English steam train enthusiast, you're very into big steam engines, you know, you like to read about the history and the different railway lines and the different manufacturers and all the rest of this stuff, and you have a forum with all your friends. And there's some new kid on the forum who's about 12 or 14, he's reading Wikipedia and he's really interested in all this stuff, and you kind of get chatting to him, and you know, you assume that he's in Shropshire or Ireland, or you know, he might even be in someplace like California. And then he says, by the way, we've got an outbreak of Ebola in my village. I live in Malawi, and I'm wondering if anybody knows how to treat this particular set of symptoms and whether it's Ebola or not, because my sister is sick. And the whole mental world of your steam train enthusiast completely collapses, because what they've just discovered is they're talking to a 12-year-old kid that saw a steam train in a museum when they were 7 and got obsessed with it. But the kid is in Malawi, and their complete model of the world collapses. Right? This is coming. It's going to be the worst culture shock the human race has ever seen, because the poor are coming to us. Part of the danger of Facebook is it makes it extremely difficult for poor people and rich people to communicate. Buffers and buffers and buffers and layers and layers and layers, unlike email where it's a simple flat space. Bam, right? what happens when you start getting 419 scam messages from refugee camps only now they're real? Right? I am in this refugee camp, here are my GPS coordinates, here's my Facebook, here's my blog, here's my Twitter, here's my PayPal, here's my Flatter, here's my Bitcoin. Send me some money. I'm hungry. I'm really smart. I will go through your email and I will take out the spam. I will help your kids answer their college questions. Right? I used to be a school teacher and I'm stuck in this bloody refugee camp and my kids are hungry. Sort me out. Right? We have no idea what's coming off the internet when we get little Android phones with decent operating systems in every single poor person's hand. There's a decent chance that it's going to break Western civilization like a log being split bananas. Because the guilt that we all share for colonialism and for the exploitation of the poor that goes on all the time. Right? Every piece of hardware in this room was manufactured by people who have no political freedom in China. Every single piece has a little piece of Chinese fascism inside of it, which is why you paid 1,100 euros and not 5,500 euros. All of that stuff is coming up and it's going to hit us really freaking hard, really before we're culturally ready for it. All I can say is, take a holiday in the third world, take a good look around, those people are going to come online soon. And the challenges that we have with the current round of economic difficulty now, people use words like collapse or austerity or whatever it happens to be, compared to the cultural chaos and the need for radical political change that is going to come as the villages come online, as the refugee camps come online, as the slave-holding nations come online, as the slums come online, it's going to blow our world to pieces. And we're going to have to negotiate that within the next 10 years. So as you guys face this first round of trouble, you know, I'm facing my own round of trouble where I lived in Ireland, a bit less when I'm in the UK. As we actually have to face that stuff head on, the next wave coming after it is the people with much worse problems who are going to turn around and be like, look, I understand that you guys are having some trouble, but you're still making 17 times our national average income, and you buy products from us at $11 a ton, because every time we raise the prices, you assassinate our president. We're having a problem here. Right? And these people are going to start talking to us and asking us to change our ways. They're going to start blogging about the fact that their kid sister has just died of malnutrition. I've had my PayPal up here, you know, for 17 days, and all I've gotten is $5.51, and I can't get it out because of the bloody terms of service, and my kid sister is dead. Jesus Christ, this is a disaster. Yeah, it is. Right? We're in the easy part right now. To put yourself in the global 1%, you only require an average income of $36,000 a year, which is about, what, 26,000 euros? That makes you global 1%. Occupy, oh, those people over there, they're the 1%, they're totally screwing us. Oh my God, where did all those people come from? There are 99 of them, it's me. Right? Occupy was completely turned around the wrong way, because Occupy wanted to believe that if they got their politics right, they could have some of the stuff from over there. They didn't want to look behind them at all the people over here who were trying to get their share of the pie. Right? How poor would we feel if we had to pay fair trade prices for our coffee, for our tea, for our sugar, for our gasoline, for our electronics, for our clothes? If all of the countries that produce the things you wear and the things you use had full political freedom for workers, what would the prices really be like? We live in an artificially inflated bubble of prosperity that is extracted from the poor at gunpoint. And if we're going to be fighting for freedom, it's eventually going to have to go beyond software, it's going to have to go beyond hardware, it's going to have to go right to the ends of the earth, because we're heading towards the point where asking questions about why not a global democracy becomes realistic. Because after they all have telephones, and after they all have names in the database, we can start asking questions about why they don't all have votes. And that's really where the fun begins. The United Nations automatically assumes that you have political representation at home, and therefore you don't need any direct representation from ordinary people at the United Nations. This turns out to be absolutely not true. Most of the countries in the United Nations gag their citizens at home. They have no direct representation, and so the UN is not an effective political representation of the people. It's simply an oligarchy of states intended to perpetuate the existence of the state. Once we've got internet in the villages, it becomes possible to realistically talk about one world, one man, one vote. Or I should say one world, one person, one vote. Now, can we imagine the consequences of that? And that's not so far from where we are in the group, right? You know, browser ID, if you get that stuff right, becomes a hard enough identity potential, you could use it for voting. Really seriously, you could do this. Or maybe Facebook will do it and then we'll all be screwed because Facebook will own the voter rolls and you know, once in a while you lose a couple of 100 million. The fight for global democracy, and I'm not even sure democracy is the right thing to build, but the fight for global democracy goes from being theory to practice by 2020. Does this begin to sound like fun? All the processes that run that transition need to be as open as possible. All the software needs to be free if humanly possible. The interesting part of the free software story is just about to begin. Because if the artifact that connects you to the world, right, the little Android phone that takes you from the 4th century to the 21st century, if that phone is fully open and you control it, then you get political rights out of it. But if it runs proprietary software and runs on a proprietary network and they can turn you off and they don't like what you say, you get no political rights out of it at all. You know, software freedom is human freedom, and it's about to become a real critical issue because we're going to start having people who only have software to connect them to the real world. They only have software to connect them to their political rights. They only have software to give them a path to life and freedom. And that's going to be the real challenge, and it's coming faster than anybody sees. All of this current round of economic austerity stuff and all the trouble in the developed world states is a tiny little warning. The real show is about to begin.